what it takes to get into a place like Brown or Yale or Harvard is you need to get those last 5 points on the SAT to move you from the 95th to the 99th percentile. And that's the thing that I think is particularly gameable and particularly requires training at taking the SAT rather than generalized academic education.
I assume now that what you're saying about law schools and elite stratification would apply more broadly to higher education. We're both in the Ivy League here, et cetera. Everybody wants to get in. Someone was telling me, one of my colleagues last night, that Brown has moved up in the rankings of universities, and we're now ahead of Princeton. And somebody, U.S. News and World Report, or somebody's ranking. And I said, oh, that's great. And I asked, what were the measures that you used to compare universities? And one of the principal ones is, how low is your acceptance rate?
Yes.
You know, because that shows you're exclusive, you know, and you want to reject people. I said, oh, we're better if we reject more people. I mean, doesn't that give you pause? So we were talking about that. But you think American higher education is, I should ask you, I know kind of what your answer is going to be because we had this conversation before, but everybody didn't hear it. What do you think, in light of the meritocracy trap, is wrong with American higher education more broadly?
Well, it's much too intensive and much too exclusive.
Would you get rid of SAT scores? Excuse me again.
You know, I might get, the SAT is complicated. I probably on balance would get rid of the SAT scores. At the moment, I think given where we are, the SAT is one of the facets of college admissions that is most biased in favor of prior privilege, both race and class. And there's data to support this, that, you know, if admissions were based exclusively on the SAT score, you know, elite colleges would be substantially richer and substantially more white than they are right now.
Let me just clarify. You're not saying that the SAT doesn't measure anything relevant. You're just saying whatever it measures is more prevalent amongst those who have class privilege.
Yeah, so I'm saying two things. I do think it measures something relevant, and I think it's complicated. The studies that suggest that the SAT has a very low or relatively low correlation with college performance are, I think, almost all fundamentally flawed, because the nature of selectivity at universities mean that they can look at only a relatively narrow band of SAT inputs and the full distribution of college grades. Whereas if a place like Brown started taking people who were in the 5th percentile on the SAT, they would not do well at Brown.
Right.
So I do think it measures something, but I think it is actually one of the most gameable components of the admissions process. It is incredibly sensitive to training and to practice tests and to tutors who specialize in getting people to get higher scores. And so in that sense, it's become an opportunity for elites to advantage their children. And I think it is a greater opportunity than other parts of the application portfolio. And there's data to support that. So for that reason, I'm skeptical of including it. You know, the complication is compared to what? And if we have an incredibly stratified high school system and connections can help people get into college, you know, one thing the SAT even now is good for is it identifies the, you know, exceptional outlier who doesn't have other forms of privilege, but does really well. And I think that's real. I think that's a real thing that it does. And so there's a balance here. I think overall it favors the elite, but it also opens up doors for exceptional cases. And one has to trade off those two effects to decide, all things considered, whether it's benign or not.
Okay, just a sidebar question here. It's a little bit technical, but you say on the one hand, if we had an unrestricted range in the data, we'd be able to find the correlation between SAT and post-admissions performance, because it's surely the case if someone comes in with very low scores, they're unlikely to do well at a demanding college. On the other hand, you say it's manipulable, or one of those indicia that's most susceptible to what you're calling gaming. And I'm wondering how those two things can both be true at the same time. I mean, I understand that you can take prep courses and that will have some effect on your SAT score, but the prep courses that affect your SAT score may also affect your performance after you get into college? I mean, don't you have to assume that some part of the SAT score really isn't the part that's susceptible to gaming isn't really, measuring a productive trait? It's just measuring a kind of practicum, a kind of, I saw multiple choice questions before. Now I know how to answer them, kind of like that.
Yeah, look, so I think one thing that's important here about the underlying data is that the gap between the SAT scores of the privileged elite and the middle class is much, much greater than the gap between the SAT scores of the middle class and people in poverty. So, for example, in a recent year, if your household income was over $200,000 a year, that puts you in about the top 4% of the income distribution. Your average SAT score was 250 points higher than the average SAT score of a kid whose household income was right at the American median. Whereas the kid at the median, on average, scored only 125 points higher than a kid whose household income was $20,000 or less, so at or below the poverty line. And the reason why I raised this in response to your question is that when you combine that fact with the incredible intensity of competition for admission, what it takes to get into a place like Brown or Yale or Harvard is, you need to get those last 5 points on the SAT to move you from the 95th to the 99th percentile. And that's the thing that I think is particularly gameable and particularly requires training at taking the SAT rather than generalized academic education.
That's very helpful, actually. So I want to go back to talking about assortative mating, about the family, about helicopter parents who hover, about tiger moms, about people who are competing to get into the right preschool in New York City so that they can get into the right prep school. So
5% admissions rate at some of these preschools.
How are you going to stop people from doing that? They love their kids, and everybody wants their kid, to be on top. I mean, this is a very natural thing about human behavior, it would seem to me.
Right. I mean, look, there are some ways you could stop doing that, which would be harsh interventions unimaginable in our social and legal order. And I might be skeptical of them. I suspect you'd be very skeptical of them. But so, for example, the city of Berlin recently enacted a statute that makes it effectively illegal for a nursery school to charge its parents more than roughly 80 euros a month above the state subsidy level. So that in Berlin, it's not really possible to have gold-plated nursery schools. So one way to do it is to make it illegal. Another way to do it, which is more palatable, I think, is to observe that the tax exemption that elite private schools have is in fact a massive reverse subsidy from the middle class to the elite.
Yeah.
And that's true all the way up through university. Somebody recently calculated that Princeton University's tax exemption, if you include the exemption from taxes on its endowment income and the tax deductions that donors get, amounts to a subsidy of about $100,000 per Princeton student per year, which is 40 times as much as the public subsidy given to Essex County Community College.
And it's more than the tuition that the kids are paying.
More than the tuition that they're paying, absolutely. And there are more students at Princeton from the top 1% of the income distribution than from the bottom 60%. And that's also true at St. Anne's School in Brooklyn, or the Dalton School, or the very posh preschools in Manhattan. And so one thing one might do is say to these schools, unless you have a more economically diverse student body, we're going to treat you as a private club rather than as a public charity and take away your tax exemption. That seems to me actually a relatively appealing legal change.
Let me observe that even if I were to look at public institutions, the University of California system, University of North Carolina system, University of Michigan system, there are many campuses, and they are ranked. There are flagship campuses like Berkeley and UCLA, there's Cal State, Fullerton, there's, so even within a public system that's paid for by taxpayer dollars, educators and administrators have seen fit to construct differentiated, some very selective, some less so, some even less so, hierarchy of institutions. Now, is that an artifact of something, or is it a reflection of the need to meet, the demands of the workplace, the preparation of students? I mean, one reason I want to stratify and specialize is because I think I can teach the advanced material more effectively, et cetera. So again, I'm kind of pushing back against this. We see the hierarchy, but it needn't be that way. And I'm wondering if University of California isn't telling us something that,
Yeah. I mean, look, first of all, I was a math major in college, and Serge Lang was one of my professors, who was an algebraist and
I was a math major too. I've heard of Lang.
Yeah, who attacked the social sciences. But he used to say that to reject an extreme is not to affirm its opposite. And so it's not part of my view that there is no appropriate place for selection, hierarchy, stratification. It's just my view that our version of this is so extreme that we could reduce it materially, and maybe more than materially, a lot, and not lose the legitimate advantages of some degree of selectivity. But the second point is, when we have created a labor market and a workforce in which, for example, we've stripped middle management out of American companies so that either you are a high-flying manager with a business school degree, or you have very little managerial discretion in your job, and it's very hard to work your way up from the mailroom to the corner office. What that means is that our education system is also going to become hierarchical and stratified, because it's going to need to select people who can jump into the super elite work early on in their careers, rather than getting people so that they have certain basic skills which allow them to enter into a relatively less stratified workplace, maybe get some workplace training, rise as much as they rise, and then the technology that organizes work, in this case managerial technology, will be much less hierarchical and stratified, and so you won't need as many super managers as we have now. There are lots of reasons. U.S. workplaces used to provide massive amounts of workplace training to their employees. They now provide effectively none. There are lots of reasons why that's the case. One, I think, interesting for economists is that the demise of unions and the rise of high-frequency labor markets and people shifting jobs all the time has meant that if one employer trains its employees, that employer's competitor will be able to poach the training employer's workers by paying a wage that the training employer can't afford to pay because they've incurred the training costs. And so now you're in a kind of prisoner's dilemma in which nobody trains, because if anybody does train, they'll pay to train their competitor's workforce. Yeah. Whereas, for example, a union wage scale, which makes wages depend on seniority, is actually a coordinating technique that allows everybody to train.